Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In a remote corner of the Boston Mountains, nestled within the vast expanse of the Ozark National Forest, where limestone bluffs rise high above spring-fed creeks, there once stood a peculiar dwelling that locals referred to simply as the Stump House. The year was 1954, and the dense hardwood forests of northern Arkansas had long harbored secrets among their ancient oaks and hickories. It was in this isolated region, where cell reception fails and GPS signals falter even today, that Ambrose Caldwell first settled on a plot of land so remote that the nearest neighbor was 3 miles away down a winding dirt road that became impassable after heavy rains. Ambrose wasn't from these parts. According to county records and the recollections of those few who interacted with him, he arrived from somewhere in the Northeast. Pennsylvania, perhaps, though accounts vary, with nothing but a rusted pickup truck loaded with tools and a determined expression etched into his weathered face. The parcel of land he purchased was considered worthless by most, too rocky for farming, too far from town for convenience, and too densely wooded to develop without considerable effort. But the price was right, and Ambrose seemed to value one thing above all else: solitude. What made Ambrose's homestead remarkable wasn't just its isolation, but the dwelling he constructed. Using the massive remnants of an ancient oak that had been struck by lightning decades earlier, Ambrose hollowed out and expanded the enormous stump, reinforcing it with timber harvested from his land. He constructed a roof of hand-split shingles and built a stone chimney that rose from the back of the structure. The result was something between a cabin and a cave, a habitation that seemed to grow organically from the forest floor itself, nearly invisible from more than 20 yards away, blending perfectly with the surrounding wilderness. The few locals who glimpsed the Stump House described it with a mixture of admiration and unease. Marjorie Wilkins, who delivered mail along the rural routes, recalled in a 1967 interview with the County Historical Society that the structure sat so natural in them woods you could walk right past it if you weren't looking careful. First time I came upon it, I thought I was seeing things like the forest itself had grown a door and windows. She also noted that despite delivering mail to Ambrose's box at the distant road junction for over 2 years, she never once saw smoke from his chimney, even on the coldest winter days. Sheriff Donovan Mercer, who served Newton County from 1951 to 1964, recorded in his journals that he first encountered Ambrose during a routine patrol of the backcountry in spring of 1955. "Met the hermit everyone's been talking about," he wrote. "Seems harmless enough. Claims he came here for the peace and quiet after some trouble back east. Didn't elaborate on what kind of trouble, and I didn't press. Man's got a right to his privacy out here, long as he keeps to himself and doesn't cause problems." And for nearly 3 years, Ambrose did keep to himself. He would appear in the small town of Jasper once a month to purchase supplies: coffee, flour, ammunition, and the occasional bottle of whiskey, speaking little, making eye contact less, and departing as soon as his business was concluded. Lorelei Thornton, whose family ran the general store in those days, recalled that Ambrose always paid in cash, always exact change, and never lingered. There was nothing outwardly threatening about him, she told a local historian in 1968, but something about the way he moved, the way his eyes never seemed to rest on any one thing for long. It put folks on edge, like he was always watching for something that might be coming after him. The few hunters and trappers who occasionally ventured near his property reported that Ambrose had established a neat, if Spartan, existence. A small garden provided vegetables. A smokehouse preserved the game he hunted. A hand-dug, well-supplied water. But they also noted that the approach to his stump house was unusually difficult to navigate, with deadfalls and thorny brush seemingly arranged to discourage casual visitors. Some swore they heard the metallic click of traps being set after dusk. Harrison Jeffries, who ran a trap line not far from Ambrose's property during the winters of 1955 and 1956, described an unsettling encounter in his personal journal, later donated to the Arkansas Folklore Collection. "Come across Caldwell today while checking my western line, or Schweffer," he wrote on January 12, 1956. "He was kneeling by a big oak, not moving, just staring at the bark like he was reading something written there. Didn't notice me for a good 5 minutes, though I wasn't trying to be quiet. When he finally saw me, he jumped up like he'd been caught doing something shameful. Asked what I wanted in a voice that didn't sound right, hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in weeks. When I said I was just checking my traps, he got real insistent that I stay on my side of the creek, said his land wasn't safe for strangers, looked pale as a ghost, and thin. Don't think he's been eating right." It wasn't until September of 1957 that Ambrose Caldwell's solitary existence intersected with another newcomer to the area. Virgil Rawlins, a former military man with experience in demolition and construction, purchased 50 acres adjoining Ambrose's land with the intention of building a hunting lodge. Virgil was everything Ambrose was not: gregarious, open, and quickly embraced by the small community. He spoke of plans to bring in small hunting parties from Memphis and Little Rock, promising economic opportunities for locals who might serve as guides or cooks. The first documented interaction between the two men occurred when Virgil, in an apparent gesture of neighborliness, hiked over to introduce himself to Ambrose. According to Virgil's later account, documented in a statement to Sheriff Mercer, the encounter was brief and uncomfortable. "He didn't invite me inside," Virgil reported. "Stood in the doorway of that strange house of his like he was guarding something, told me straight out he valued his privacy and didn't appreciate having a commercial operation next door. When I tried to assure him my plans were modest, he just stared at me with those pale eyes of his and said, 'This forest has ways of rejecting what doesn't belong.' Felt like a threat, though he delivered it calm as could be, like he was just stating a fact about the weather." Virgil also noted something odd about the interior of the Stump house, visible through the partially open door. It was darker inside than it should have been, he recalled. Like the shadows were thicker somehow, and there was a smell not bad exactly, but strange. Made me think of limestone caves and old medical cabinets, that mix of earth and chemicals. But the strangest thing was the floor. From what I could see, it wasn't dirt or wood planks, but some kind of stone arranged in a spiral pattern. Looked old, a lot older than the house itself. Over the following weeks, Virgil began the preliminary work of clearing land for his lodge. He hired 4 local men to help with the labor, and progress was steady until the accidents began. First, a chainsaw inexplicably malfunctioned, nearly taking off the operator's arm. Then, a section of forest that had been marked for clearing caught fire overnight, though there had been no lightning and no one had been smoking in the area. Most disturbing was the morning Virgil's crew arrived to find dozens of dead crows arranged in a precise circle around the foundation they had begun to dig. According to statements collected by Sheriff Mercer, now preserved in the County Historical Society's archives, the workers attributed these occurrences to bad luck or perhaps forest spirits, a persistent superstition in the Ozarks even in the mid-20th century. Virgil, however, had his suspicions. The placement of the dead birds in particular seemed too deliberate to be the work of nature or coincidence. When small tools began to go missing, and one morning the men arrived to find their previous day's work completely undone, Virgil decided to maintain a nighttime vigil. What happened during that night of October 12, 1957, remains a matter of conjecture based on fragmented accounts. Virgil had positioned himself in a blind overlooking the construction site, armed with a rifle and a thermos of coffee. around 2 a.m. According to his statement, he observed a figure moving with surprising stealth through the partially cleared land. Though the moon was nearly full, Virgil claimed the figure seemed to avoid its light, keeping to the shadows in a way that suggested practice and purpose. "I called out for whoever it was to identify themselves," Virgil's statement reads, "and that's when I saw it was Caldwell. He froze for a second, then bolted like a spooked deer. I fired a warning shot, aimed high just to let him know I was serious, and took off after him. Followed him back toward his property, but lost him in the thicket. That man knows the forest better than the animals do." The next morning, Virgil reported the incident to Sheriff Mercer, who reluctantly agreed to ride out to Ambrose's property to investigate. The sheriff's official report indicates that Ambrose denied any involvement, suggesting that Virgil had perhaps seen a deer or bear, and, being unfamiliar with the woods at night, mistaken it for a person. When pressed, Ambrose reportedly became increasingly agitated, eventually ordering the sheriff off his property with the cryptic warning that some boundaries shouldn't be crossed. In the absence of concrete evidence beyond Virgil's word, Sheriff Mercer could take no official action. He did, however, note in his personal journal that Ambrose's Stump house seemed different somehow, the interior darker than should have been possible given the two small windows, and a peculiar odor, not quite decay, not quite chemical, something I cannot name, but that made the hairs on my neck stand up. He also observed that while the exterior of the dwelling appeared roughly the same size as a large room, the interior felt smaller, as though space itself was compressed, or some portion hidden from view. The sheriff's journal also contains a detail not included in his official report. As he was leaving, he noticed what appeared to be fresh digging behind the Stump house, partially concealed by a pile of brush. When questioned about it, Ambrose claimed he had been expanding his root cellar for the coming winter, but refused to show the sheriff this supposed improvement. More telling was the sheriff's observation that Ambrose's hands, normally calloused but clean, during his monthly visits to town, were now stained with what looked like dark soil embedded deeply beneath his fingernails, as though he had been digging with his bare hands. The situation might have remained a simple neighbor dispute had it not escalated dramatically 3 days later. Virgil, determined to continue his project despite the strange occurrences, brought in additional workers and a small bulldozer to expedite the clearing process. By mid-afternoon, they had made significant progress, pushing the cleared area to within 100 yards of the invisible boundary with Ambrose's property. It was then that one of the workers, operating the bulldozer near a cluster of old-growth trees, reported that the blade struck something solid that wasn't a rock or root. Initial investigation revealed what appeared to be a metal box or trunk, approximately 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, partially exposed by the bulldozer's work. According to multiple witness statements, Virgil instructed the men to carefully excavate around the object, speculating that it might be a cash box or valuable cash, perhaps even dating back to the Civil War, when both Union and Confederate sympathizers were known to have hidden resources in the remote Ozark wilderness. As the men worked to uncover the mysterious container, one reported seeing Ambrose watching from the tree line, motionless and silent. When they called out to him, he disappeared back into the forest. The excavation continued, and by late afternoon, they had fully exposed what turned out to be a heavily padlocked metal trunk, reinforced with bands of iron, showing significant corrosion but remaining intact. Jebediah Simmons, one of the workers present that day, later told Sheriff Mercer that the moment the trunk was fully revealed, a hush fell over the woods like I ain't never experienced before. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of leaves rustling, though there was still a breeze. Like everything was holding its breath, waiting, and cold. It got cold all of a sudden, though the sun was still high, made the hair on my arms stand up. Virgil decided to break the lock rather than leave the trunk overnight, concerned it might disappear if left unattended. Using the bulldozer's blade as an improvised anvil and a sledgehammer from his tools, he managed to shatter the ancient lock after several powerful blows. The accounts of what happened next vary slightly in detail but align in substance. Inside the trunk were carefully wrapped bundles of yellowed papers, what appeared to be journals or logbooks, with dates spanning from 1883 to 1902, several glass vials containing unidentified powders, and most disturbingly a collection of human teeth, each meticulously labeled with names and dates. Beneath these items, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved it with remarkable effectiveness, was a leather-bound volume with no title, its pages filled with text in what one witness described as "no language I've ever seen," with drawings that made no natural sense. According to the statement of Marcus Webb, one of the laborers present, Virgil had just begun to examine the strange book when Ambrose emerged from the forest, moving with unexpected speed for a man of his age and build. His face was transformed, Webb reported. I'd seen him in town, always quiet, keeping to himself, but this wasn't the same man. His eyes were wide, his mouth twisted in a way that didn't look human, and he was screaming things that made no sense, about breaking the seal and letting it wake up. What followed was described by all witnesses as a brief but violent confrontation. Ambrose, armed with nothing but apparent desperation, lunged for the trunk and its contents. Virgil, startled by the sudden attack, defended himself with the heavy flashlight he'd been using to examine the find. In the ensuing struggle, Ambrose was struck on the temple with sufficient force to render him unconscious. Webb's statement includes a detail that the others present either did not notice or chose not to mention. As Ambrose fell unconscious, Webb swears he saw something like a shadow or a mist rise from the man's mouth and nostrils, hovering briefly before dissipating into the air. Webb, a devout Baptist, interpreted this as the man's soul leaving his body, though he acknowledged it might have been a trick of the fading light or the stress of the moment. Sheriff Mercer, summoned by one of the workers who drove into town, arrived to find Ambrose restrained with rope, still unconscious, and Virgil and his men in a state of agitated confusion about their discovery. The sheriff's official report indicates that he took custody of both Ambrose and the trunk's contents, transporting the former to the county medical facility for treatment and securing the latter in the evidence room at his office. Ambrose regained consciousness during the night but refused to speak to medical personnel or the deputy posted to guard him. By morning, he had developed a high fever and begun muttering continuously in what the attending physician, Dr. Harold Vance, described as nonsensical phrases, possibly a foreign language, or more likely the delusions of a mind compromised by injury and isolation. The fever continued to rise throughout the day, despite treatment, and shortly after midnight, Ambrose Caldwell died without having provided any coherent explanation for his violent reaction to the discovery of the trunk. Dr. Vance's medical notes, preserved in the county archives, include transcriptions of some of Ambrose's final utterances. Most were indeed incomprehensible, but several phrases stand out as particularly troubling. 9 minds in one vessel, he reportedly said repeatedly, followed by, "The roots go deeper than the tree." Most coherent and disturbing was his final statement before lapsing into unconsciousness for the last time. "It's been feeding on me from below, but now it will feed on everyone." An autopsy was performed by Dr. Vance, who had limited forensic training, but served as the county's default medical examiner. His report, still preserved in county archives, notes the head injury as contributing to Ambrose's death, but identifies the primary cause as acute systemic failure of indeterminate origin. More puzzling were his observations about Ambrose's internal condition. The organs present abnormalities inconsistent with the subject's apparent age and outward health, he wrote. The liver, in particular, shows advanced degradation similar to cases of prolonged toxic exposure. While the heart muscle exhibits unusual fibrous structures, I cannot identify with my available resources. Most peculiar is the presence of a crystalline formation adhered to the inner surface of the cranium, measuring approximately 3 cm in diameter. Dr. Vance sent samples of the crystalline formation to a former colleague at the University of Arkansas Medical School, but no record exists of any analysis or response. The samples themselves are not mentioned in any inventory of evidence related to the case and appear to have been either discarded or misplaced. Dr. Vance himself left Jasper less than a month after Ambrose's death, accepting a position at a hospital in Little Rock. In a letter to a colleague, discovered among his effects after his own death in 1972, he expressed misgivings about his work in Newton County. "I left some questions unanswered in the hill country," he wrote, "and I suspect it's better that way. Some knowledge isn't meant for general circulation, and some phenomena resist classification within our current understanding of natural law." While the medical mystery of Ambrose's death remained unsolved, Sheriff Mercer turned his attention to the contents of the trunk. The journals, once examined, proved to be the records of Dr. Augustus Montague, a physician who had apparently established a private sanatorium on the very land where Ambrose later built his Stump house. According to these meticulous records, Montague had relocated from Philadelphia in 1882, purchasing over 200 acres of remote forest land to establish what he termed a retreat for research and treatment of spiritual corporeal anomalies rejected by conventional medical understanding. The journals documented Montague's treatment of 9 patients over the course of 20 years, though their names had been encoded as numbers, and the specific nature of their conditions was obscured by Montague's idiosyncratic terminology and frequent diversions into philosophical speculation. What was clear, however, was that his methods grew increasingly unorthodox over time, incorporating elements of chemistry, electrical stimulation, and practices drawn from what he referred to as pre-scientific wisdom traditions. One journal entry from 1887 provides a glimpse into Montague's evolving approach. Patient 7 exhibited the anticipated response to the tincture derived from fungal specimens harvested from the ancient oak's roots. The visions reported align precisely with those described by patients 3 and 5, suggesting a consistent channel of access to what I have termed the substrate consciousness. Most significant is the recurring motif of spiral patterns and the sensation of minds overlapping, which all 3 subjects reported independently. I'm increasingly convinced that what medical science dismisses as delusion or hallucination represents genuine perception of an underlying reality typically filtered by our limited sensory apparatus. The teeth discovered in the trunk corresponded to entries in the later journals, where Montague had apparently begun extracting them from his patients as part of a procedure he believed would excise the focal points of psychic contagion. More disturbing were references to a substrate or essence he claimed to have distilled from these extractions, which he administered back to the patients in carefully measured doses. By 1895, Montague's journals show a marked shift in tone, with increasing references to his own participation in the treatments. "I have begun the integration process myself," he wrote in April of that year. The preliminary sensations are as the patients described: disorientation, temporal displacement, and the curious experience of thoughts that are not one's own moving through consciousness like fish through water. Most remarkable is the sense of expansion, as though my mind now occupies a volume far greater than the physical constraints of my skull would permit. The final journal entry, dated October 17, 1902, was particularly troubling. Written in a hand that had grown increasingly erratic compared to the precise script of earlier entries, it read, "The merger is complete. What was 9 is now 1, and what was separate now flows together. I have become the vessel for the convergence, as I always suspected would be necessary. The others are gone, physically gone, though their essence remains. The process cannot be reversed, but it can be contained. I have prepared the chamber beneath the great oak. It will hold what I have become until a more permanent solution presents itself. If these words are read, know that the seal must not be broken. What sleeps must remain asleep. No further entries appeared in the journal. Historical records confirmed that a Dr. Augustus Montague had indeed purchased land in the area in 1882, but there was no record of a sanatorium ever being officially registered. More significantly, there was no death certificate or burial record for Montague, nor any documentation of what became of his property after 1902. The land records simply showed a gap in ownership until 1938, when a timber company acquired a large tract that included the former Montague property, only to sell it off in parcels after determining that the cost of accessing the remote timber exceeded its value. Additional research by Sheriff Mercer uncovered fragmentary evidence about Montague's background. Before moving to the Ozarks, he had been a respected physician in Philadelphia, known for his work with patients suffering from what were then called nervous disorders. Records from the Pennsylvania Medical Society indicated that Montague had presented several papers on the relationship between physical and mental health, advocating for a more integrated approach to treatment. His last published work, appearing in a medical journal in 1881, proposed controversial theories about consciousness existing independently of the brain, a position that apparently damaged his professional standing and may have contributed to his decision to relocate to the remote Ozarks. The leather-bound volume found beneath the journals proved even more disturbing than Montague's medical records. The text, as described by witnesses, consisted of symbols and pictographs unlike any known writing system, interspersed with anatomical drawings that seemed to blend human and non-human characteristics. Most prevalent were spiral motifs that appeared on nearly every page, growing more complex as the book progressed. The final pages consisted solely of these spirals, with no text at all. The patterns so intricate and precise that they created an illusion of depth and movement when viewed, a detail noted independently by several people who examined the volume. Sheriff Mercer, faced with what appeared to be evidence of historical crimes but no living perpetrator to prosecute, consulted with the county prosecutor about how to proceed. Their deliberations were rendered moot, however, when the evidence room was broken into 3 nights after Ambrose's death. The only items taken were the contents of the trunk. The break-in showed no signs of forced entry, leading to suspicions about an inside job, but no suspects were ever identified. Deputy Walter Prescott, who had been on duty the night of the theft but reported seeing or hearing nothing unusual, resigned from the sheriff's department 2 weeks later. He sold his home in Jasper and reportedly moved to California, though subsequent attempts to locate him there proved unsuccessful. In a curious parallel to Ambrose Caldwell, Prescott had been observed to become increasingly withdrawn in the days leading up to his resignation, and several colleagues noted that he appeared unwell, with one describing him as gray-faced and jumpy, like a man who hasn't slept in a week. Virgil Rawlins, perhaps unsettled by the strange events and Ambrose's disturbing death, abandoned his plans for a hunting lodge. He sold his property at a loss to a paper company and reportedly moved to California. The land where Ambrose's Stump house stood was eventually incorporated into the Ozark National Forest through a government acquisition program in the early 1960s. Before leaving the area, however, Virgil provided a final troubling statement to the Newton County Gazette. In a letter to the editor published on November 3, 1957, he wrote, "I came to these mountains seeking opportunity and found something else entirely. I have seen things in these woods that defy explanation, things that have no place in a rational world. I caution anyone considering development in the vicinity of the old Caldwell property to reconsider. Some places are better left undisturbed, some secrets better left buried. The forest has its own rules, its own consciousness, and it does not welcome those who fail to respect its boundaries. The Stump house itself might have been forgotten entirely had it not been for a forest fire in the summer of 1968 that swept through the area. When Forest Service personnel surveyed the damage, they discovered something unusual in the burned-out remains of the dwelling. Beneath what had been the floor of Ambrose's home, accessible via a narrow trapdoor that had been concealed beneath a heavy cabinet, they found a descending shaft approximately 10 feet deep, lined with stone and leading to a small chamber. The chamber, roughly circular and about 12 feet in diameter, contained nothing but a stone pedestal in its center. The pedestal showed signs of having once held something, but whatever it was had been removed. More interesting to the surveyors were the walls of the chamber, which were covered in carved symbols, similar to those described in the now-missing Montague Journal. According to their report, the symbols appeared to form continuous lines that spiraled around the chamber from floor to ceiling, creating complex patterns that seemed to shift and flow when viewed peripherally. Forest Ranger Samuel Tate, who led the initial survey team, noted in his report that the chamber appeared to be much older than the Stump house above it. The stonework used in its construction suggested significant age, with techniques resembling those found in structures dating to the early 19th century. More puzzling was his observation that the spiral carvings showed no weathering despite their apparent age, with edges as crisp and defined as if they had been cut recently. Dr. Elias Whitcomb, an anthropologist from the University of Arkansas who was called in to examine the site, noted that while some elements resembled known alphabets or pictographic systems, the overall composition matched no documented writing system. More puzzling was his observation that the stone showed no tool marks despite the intricate carving, and that the spiraling lines, when measured, followed a mathematical progression that he described as non-intuitive to human cognitive patterns. In his preliminary report, Dr. Whitcomb wrote, "The precision of the spiral sequences suggests knowledge of mathematical principles typically associated with advanced theoretical geometry. Yet the execution lacks evidence of the tools necessary to achieve such precision." More troubling is the psychological effect of prolonged observation of the patterns. Subjects report visual distortions and altered consciousness states consistent with hypnotic induction, despite having no predisposition to hypnotic susceptibility. I strongly recommend restricted access to the site pending further investigation. Perhaps most disturbing was the reaction of those who spent time in the underground chamber. All 4 members of the initial survey team reported experiencing intense headaches and nausea after less than an hour in the space. 2 developed unexplained nosebleeds. 1, Ranger Thomas Sullivan, described vivid auditory hallucinations that persisted for several days afterward, voices speaking in what he called overlapping whispers that seemed to respond to his thoughts rather than his spoken words. Sullivan's personal journal, shared with researchers years later by his widow, contains entries from the weeks following his exposure to the chamber. "The whispers are becoming clearer," he wrote 10 days after the incident. "At first I thought I was losing my mind, but now I'm not so sure. They speak with different voices but the same intent, as though multiple minds are sharing the same thoughts. They tell me things about the forest, about the patterns beneath the surface of things, about connections I never perceived before." Most disturbing is the recurring instruction to prepare the vessel. I don't know what this means, but the compulsion to understand grows stronger each day. Sullivan took medical leave 3 weeks after his examination of the chamber. He never returned to his Forest Service duties and was found dead in his home 2 months later, an apparent suicide. The coroner's report noted that Sullivan had extracted all of his own teeth prior to his death. The bloodied implements found arranged in a spiral pattern on his bathroom floor. Dr. Whitcomb himself cut short his examination after experiencing what he later described as an overwhelming sensation of presence, not simply being watched, but being surrounded, immersed in an awareness that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. His request for further study was denied when higher authorities in the Forest Service ordered the shaft filled in and the site marked as unstable ground, effectively burying whatever secrets the chamber might have held. In a paper published in an obscure anthropological journal in 1972, Whitcomb speculated that the chamber might have predated Montague's sanatorium, suggesting it could have been constructed by early settlers, or perhaps even have indigenous origins. More controversially, he proposed that the spiral patterns represented an attempt to document or communicate a form of consciousness different from normal human awareness, one that perceived time and space as fluid rather than fixed dimensions. The mathematical progression of the spirals, he wrote, suggests a conceptual framework in which consciousness expands outward from a central point, incorporating or absorbing other consciousnesses it encounters, much as a spiral can theoretically continue indefinitely, encompassing ever greater area while maintaining its fundamental pattern. This model aligns with certain mystical traditions, but represents them with a precision and complexity that suggests empirical rather than purely philosophical origins. The story might have ended there, relegated to local legend had it not been for the events of April 1996. Morris Harrington, a geologist conducting a mineral survey for the U.S. Geological Survey, disappeared while working in the vicinity of the old Caldwell property. His equipment and vehicle were found abandoned at his designated survey point, with no signs of wildlife attack or foul play. The search lasted 2 weeks before being called off due to lack of any promising leads. Harrington's field notes, recovered from his abandoned vehicle, contained routine geological observations up until the day before his disappearance. The final entry, however, referenced an anomalous magnetic reading from an area corresponding to the location of the former Stump house. A localized disruption of expected field strength, he wrote. Values fluctuate in a regular pattern that suggests artificial origin rather than natural formation. Possible underground structure or mineral deposit with unusual properties. We'll investigate further tomorrow. 7 months later, a hunter discovered Harrington's remains approximately 12 miles from where he had disappeared, in a remote cave system that had not been included in the search grid due to its distance from the last known location. The condition of the body presented authorities with several puzzles. Despite the extended time since his disappearance, decomposition was minimal. The medical examiner attributed this to the cool, dry conditions of the cave, though noted it was unusual, even considering those factors. More difficult to explain were the physical changes evident in Harrington's remains. His hair, brown in photos taken before his disappearance, had turned completely white. All of his teeth were missing, apparently removed with great force shortly before death based on the condition of the sockets. Most perplexing was the discovery during autopsy that his internal organs showed advanced degradation inconsistent with his age and known health status, similar in description to what had been observed in Ambrose Caldwell nearly 40 years earlier. Dr. Meredith Zhao, the medical examiner who performed the autopsy, noted another parallel to the Caldwell case, a crystalline formation attached to the inner surface of Harrington's cranium, though in this instance the growth was significantly larger, measuring nearly 8 centimeters across. Unlike in the earlier case, however, the formation was preserved and sent to a specialized laboratory for analysis. The results of this analysis, if ever completed, were never made public and are not present in any accessible records. The official cause of death was listed as exposure, with a notation that Harrington had likely experienced a psychological break that led him to wander far from his original location and eventually succumbed to the elements. What didn't appear in the official report, but was documented in the private notes of Deputy Sheriff Carolyn Lindley, was the fact that Harrington's body was found in a seated position facing the cave wall, where he appeared to have used his own blood to draw symbols matching those described in the chamber beneath Ambrose's Stump house. Even more disturbing was what Lindley found in Harrington's abandoned vehicle when she conducted a more thorough search than had been performed during the initial investigation. Hidden beneath the spare tire in the trunk was a metal box containing 9 human teeth, each wrapped in cloth labeled with different names, none of which corresponded to known missing persons in the region. Also in the box was a small notebook in which Harrington had documented what he called ground anomalies near the old Caldwell property. According to his notes, Harrington had detected unusual magnetic variations in a specific area that corresponded to where the Stump house had stood. Further investigation with ground-penetrating radar had revealed what appeared to be a void approximately 30 feet below the surface, far deeper than the chamber discovered in 1968. His final entry, dated the day before his disappearance, indicated his intention to locate a natural access point to this void through the cave systems known to honeycomb the area's limestone substrate. The entry concluded with a concerning observation. Found unusual growth on cave wall near suspected access point, crystalline structure similar to mineral formations, but exhibiting properties inconsistent with known geological processes. Structure appears to be expanding in spiral pattern, taking sample for analysis. Strange sensation when near the formation, pressure in temples, and perception of whispering voices just below audible threshold, possibly hallucination induced by cave atmosphere or exhaustion, but sensation intensifies with proximity to formation. Deputy Lindley, troubled by these discoveries but lacking official support for further investigation, took a week of personal leave to conduct her own research into the history of the area. At the County Historical Society, she found references to legends predating European settlement, collected from Cherokee sources in the late 19th century, that spoke of a place in the mountains where the sleeping one breathed beneath the earth. According to these accounts, the indigenous peoples had avoided a specific valley because they believed it contained a doorway to the long dream, where those who entered would join an eternal sleeper and become voices in its mind. More concrete was her discovery of a newspaper article from 1879 reporting the disappearance of a survey team mapping the region for railroad development. The team of 5 men had vanished without trace, their camp found intact with food still cooking over the fire. The search had centered around what was described as a remarkable large oak tree, estimated to be over 500 years old, which matched the location where Montague would later build his sanatorium, and where, decades after that, Ambrose would construct his Stump house. Lindley also uncovered correspondence between Dr. Montague and a colleague in Philadelphia, dated 1893, in which Montague made reference to finding a chamber of evident antiquity beneath his property. The construction predates any known settlement in this region, he wrote, yet exhibits mathematical precision beyond what one would expect from primitive builders. Most remarkable are the inscriptions, which I have begun to decipher using principles derived from my patient's trance state utterances. They appear to document a method for expanding consciousness beyond individual boundaries, a form of mental communion or collective awareness that transcends physical limitations. I am increasingly convinced that what we perceive as individual consciousness is merely a fragment of a larger integrated awareness artificially separated by the evolutionary development of our brains as discrete organs. Lindley's unofficial investigation came to an abrupt end when she was involved in a single-vehicle accident on a remote forest road, suffering severe injuries that required her medical retirement from the sheriff's department. In a strange twist, She had no memory of the accident itself or of the research she had been conducting, though her physical recovery was otherwise complete. The amnesia was attributed to traumatic brain injury from the crash, but some who knew her noted that her personality seemed subtly altered afterward, her former curiosity replaced by a quiet reticence, particularly regarding anything to do with the old Caldwell property. Her medical records, accessed years later by researchers investigating the case, contain a puzzling note from the neurologist who treated her. Patient presence with unusual EEG readings showing synchronized activity across brain regions, typically operating independently. When questioned about research activities prior to accident, patient exhibits physiological stress responses inconsistent with claimed amnesia, suggests suppression rather than loss of memories. Also noted, minute crystalline deposits visible in MRI of cranial cavity, origin unknown. The land remained undisturbed until 2003, when budget cuts led the Forest Service to consider selling certain non-essential holdings back to the private sector. A preliminary environmental assessment was required, and soil samples were taken from various locations, including the site of the former Stump house. The analysis revealed high concentrations of unusual mineral compounds, including rare earth elements typically associated with meteoritic material. More concerning were trace amounts of an unidentified organic compound that showed properties similar to prions, misfolded proteins associated with certain degenerative brain diseases. Dr. Miranda Zhao, the biochemist who conducted the analysis, requested permission to collect additional samples and conduct more extensive testing. Her request coincided with a policy change in the Forest Service, however, and the proposed land sale was canceled before further investigation could occur. Dr. Zhao's subsequent attempts to access the site for independent research were denied, and her initial findings were classified as part of an unspecified federal review process. In her appeal for continued access, Dr. Zhao noted, "The organic compounds present in the soil samples exhibit unprecedented properties, including the ability to reorganize cellular structures in laboratory cultures. Of particular interest is their affinity for neural tissue, which they appear to modify in ways that increase electrical conductivity between previously unconnected cells. The potential implications for understanding brain function and disease processes are significant enough to warrant immediate, thorough investigation despite any administrative hurdles." Her appeal was denied with no explanation provided. 3 months later, Dr. Zhao resigned from her position with the Environmental Protection Agency and disappeared from the scientific community entirely. Attempts by colleagues to locate her were unsuccessful, though rumors persisted that she had continued her research independently, possibly with private funding from unnamed sources. In 2010, 3 hikers ventured off the marked trails in the area, hoping to locate the legendary Stump House site that had by then become part of local folklore. Only one Jarrett McKinney emerged from the forest 3 days later, dehydrated and disoriented. His account of what happened changed with each telling, first claiming his companions had fallen into a sinkhole, then suggesting they had wandered off while he slept, and finally insisting they had walked into the tree after hearing voices calling their names. McKinney's formal statement to authorities, recorded at the hospital where he was treated for dehydration and exposure, contains elements that align disturbingly with earlier incidents. "We found what we thought was the place, just a depression in the ground now, overgrown with moss and ferns, but roughly circular like the base of a huge tree," he stated. Mason thought he heard someone calling his name from the woods, but when we looked around, there was nobody there. That night, we all had the same dream, a spiral staircase going down into darkness, with whispers coming from below, telling us we were ready to join. I woke up because of the pain, my teeth aching like they were being pulled from my gums. That's when I saw them both, eyes open, but empty somehow, walking away from camp toward where we'd found the depression. I called out, but it was like they couldn't hear me. By morning, they were gone. I searched all day but couldn't find any trace of them. A search and rescue operation found no trace of the missing hikers, though tracking dogs showed unusual behavior when brought to the area, alternating between aggressive barking and cowering with their tails tucked. The search was eventually abandoned due to dangerous weather conditions. McKinney, meanwhile, was hospitalized for what was diagnosed as acute stress reaction. During his stay, he reportedly pulled out 4 of his own teeth before being restrained, claiming they were sending signals to something in the forest. McKinney's medical records, sealed due to privacy laws but later leaked to researchers, indicate that MRI scans performed during his evaluation revealed minute crystalline structures forming along his cranial sutures, structures that a consulting neurologist noted were compositionally similar to but structurally distinct from normal calcification patterns. Most concerning was the observation that these structures appeared to be growing at a measurable rate, with follow-up scans showing a 4% increase in mass over just 72 hours. The attending psychiatrist, Dr. Neil Forsyth, documented increasingly disturbing statements from McKinney during his treatment. Patient reports thoughts that aren't mine entering his consciousness, one note reads, claims to perceive layers of time simultaneously and to feel the presence of other minds overlapping with his own. Most concerning is his insistence that these experiences represent not hallucination, but expanded awareness, language that echoes historical documents related to the Montague case without patient having any known exposure to said documents. McKinney was transferred to a specialized psychiatric facility in Missouri after 2 weeks of observation. He escaped from this facility 3 months later, evading an extensive search. 6 months after his escape, a forest ranger discovered an unusual shelter in a remote area of the Ozark National Forest, approximately 5 miles from the original Stump House site. Constructed from branches and earth in a dome-like configuration, the shelter's interior walls were covered with intricate spiral patterns carved into the wood and packed with a mixture of soil and what forensic analysis later determined to be human blood. Personal effects found in the shelter were identified as belonging to McKinney, but no trace of the man himself was found. Most disturbing was the discovery of 27 human teeth arranged in a spiral pattern on a flat stone at the center of the shelter, DNA analysis confirming they belonged to at least 7 different individuals, including McKinney himself and his 2 missing companions. The remaining teeth could not be matched to any persons in available DNA databases. The most recent documented incident connected to the site occurred in 2015, when Dr. Elias Whitcomb, by then retired from the University of Arkansas, returned to the area accompanied by a former graduate student. At 82 years old, Whitcomb had spent much of his later career researching obscure writing systems and what he termed nonlinear linguistic structures. According to his former student, Dr. Rebecca Chen, Whitcomb had become convinced that the symbols he had observed in the chamber beneath the Stump House represented something beyond a writing system, a form of encoded consciousness that could transfer information directly to the observer's mind through visual processing pathways. Chen reported that Whitcomb had developed a theoretical framework for deciphering these symbols based on decades of cross-referencing similar patterns found at sites around the world. His journals, which she shared with authorities after his disappearance, contained thousands of pages of increasingly esoteric analysis, culminating in what he called a translation matrix that would allow him to read the full message contained in the spiraling lines. The journals also revealed that Whitcomb had been in correspondence with Morris Harrington before the geologist's disappearance in 1996 and had obtained copies of Harrington's ground-penetrating radar data showing the deeper void beneath the Stump House site. Most disturbing were Whitcomb's final entries, which suggested he had begun experiencing vivid dreams in which he received visitations from what he described as the composite one, who showed him the true configuration of awareness beyond the illusion of separate minds. "I am increasingly convinced," Whitcomb wrote 3 weeks before his final expedition, "that what we perceive as individual consciousness is an evolutionary adaptation that fragments a larger, integrated awareness for the purpose of specialized function, much as a prism separates white light into discrete wavelengths. The spiral patterns represent a method for reversing this fragmentation, allowing consciousness to reconnect with its composite nature. What Montague discovered, perhaps inadvertently, was not merely a philosophical concept, but a functional technology for consciousness expansion through the integration of multiple minds into a shared awareness. The implications are profound and disturbing in equal measure." Whitcomb and Chen hiked into the forest on June 17, 2015, equipped for a 3-day expedition. Chen returned alone on June 19th, with no memory of what had happened after their first night's camp. Medical examination revealed no physical trauma or evidence of substances that might explain her amnesia. Whitcomb was never found, despite an intensive search operation that included aircraft with thermal imaging capabilities. Chen, in subsequent interviews with investigators, could recall only fragmented images from the missing period. Whitcomb, standing before a large tree stump, reciting what sounded like mathematical equations, a spiral pattern that seemed to move when she looked at it directly, and a sensation she described as minds pouring into mine like water into a glass, filling me until I should have burst, but instead I expanded, became more than myself. Few. These fragments were dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations by the psychological professionals who evaluated her. What could not be dismissed, however, was the physical evidence. Chen's camera, recovered with her other equipment, contained photos taken during the missing period, though many were distorted by unexplained light anomalies. One clear image showed Whitcomb kneeling before what appeared to be the remains of a massive tree stump, his hands pressed against its surface, his expression one of intense concentration. Another showed a close-up of a spiral pattern carved into the wood, the lines matching those described in the chamber discovered in 1968. Most puzzling was a photo apparently taken at night, showing a circle of light emanating from the ground where the stump stood. Within this circle, the forest floor appeared transformed, not illuminated, but altered, the familiar textures of soil and leaf litter replaced by what resembled a liquid surface that reflected distorted images of the surrounding trees. This photo was examined by multiple experts who concluded it had not been digitally manipulated, though none could offer a satisfactory explanation for what it depicted. One analyst from a university imaging laboratory noted that the distortion effect in the photo resembled a localized alteration of spatial properties rather than a simple visual anomaly, as though the physical laws governing that specific area had been temporarily modified. He further observed that the light emanating from the ground did not behave according to normal optical principles, appearing to bend around objects rather than being blocked by them, creating no shadows despite its apparent intensity. The final piece of evidence was a digital audio recording found on Chen's phone, time-stamped at 3:17 a.m. on June 19th, the day she emerged from the forest. The 18-minute recording began with what sounded like Whitcomb's voice reciting sequences of numbers, gradually increasing in pace and intensity until the words blended together into a continuous stream of sound. Approximately 12 minutes in, a second voice joined his, female, presumably Chen's, though she had no recollection of speaking. The two voices synchronized, speaking the same sequences simultaneously. At the 14-minute mark, a third vocal presence became audible, not a distinct voice, but what audio analysts described as a composite vocalization that seemed to contain multiple tonal elements layered together. This sound grew in volume until it dominated the recording, while Whitcomb and Chen's voices gradually faded. The final minute contained only this composite sound, which some listeners described as similar to a swarm of insects, others as resembling wind through a narrow space, and still others as reminiscent of distant, overlapping conversations. Audio specialist Dr. Javier Mendoza, who conducted a detailed analysis of the recording, noted in his report, "The composite vocalization contains identifiable elements of at least 9 distinct human speech patterns overlaid in a mathematically precise relationship. The resulting harmonic structure creates resonance patterns that produce measurable effects on neural activity in listeners, similar to certain binaural beat technologies, but significantly more complex and targeted. Extended exposure could potentially induce altered states of consciousness through entrainment of brainwave patterns. I strongly recommend limiting exposure to this audio to periods of less than 3 minutes." Forest Service officials, concerned about the potential for additional disappearances, instituted a special order closing the area to public access, citing unstable ground conditions and environmental sensitivity. A permanent marker was installed, warning of dangerous sinkholes, and the location was removed from official forest maps distributed to visitors. Dr. Rebecca Chen returned to her position at the University of Oregon, but took medical leave 6 months later, eventually resigning for unspecified health reasons. Her colleagues reported that she had become increasingly withdrawn and focused on a private research project she refused to discuss. Public records indicate she purchased a small cabin in the Ozark region in 2018, less than 20 miles from the site of Ambrose's Stump house. Local residents report occasional sightings of her in nearby towns, purchasing supplies before returning to her isolated home, though she avoids interaction beyond what is necessary to complete her transactions. Javier Norwood, the proprietor of a general store in the small community nearest Chen's cabin, described her as real quiet, keeps to herself, but polite enough when she comes in, always pays in cash, exact change, just like clockwork once a month. Reminds me of stories my granddad used to tell about that Hermit Caldwell back in the day. Norwood also noted a curious detail. She's got these blue eyes that don't seem to focus right, like she's looking at you and through you at the same time. And her hands shake something awful when she's counting out money, but steady as can be when she's writing in that journal she always carries. Strangest thing, though, is how animals react to her. Dogs won't go near her, start whining and tucking their tails if she comes close. Even the birds go quiet when she walks by. The most recent development in this decade-spanning mystery occurred in early 2023, when a routine satellite imaging survey conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey revealed an unusual pattern in the forest canopy around the restricted area. Trees appeared to be growing in a perfect spiral configuration, covering approximately 6 acres, with the center point corresponding exactly to the location where Ambrose's Stump house once stood. Forest Service botanists who examined the phenomenon found no environmental explanation for the pattern, noting that the trees themselves showed no genetic or structural abnormalities. Only their arrangement defied natural explanation. Dr. Samantha Blackwood, the lead botanist on the assessment team, wrote in her preliminary report, "The spiral formation does not correspond to any known natural growth pattern. Soil composition, sunlight exposure, water availability, and other environmental factors typically influencing forest development are consistent throughout the area and provide no explanation for the observed configuration." More puzzling is the precision of the arrangement. Trees of various species and ages align perfectly along mathematical spiral vectors, radiating from a central point. The probability of such an arrangement occurring naturally is effectively zero. The more concerning were their observations about wildlife in the area. Within and immediately surrounding the spiral pattern, they documented a complete absence of mammals larger than rodents. Birds appeared to avoid flying directly over the area, detouring around it even when it meant significantly longer flight paths. Most telling were the remains of various animals, deer, foxes, coyotes, found at the perimeter of the spiral, all exhibiting the same pattern of missing teeth and inexplicable degradation of internal organs seen in the human victims associated with the site. Dr. Blackwood's notes, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request filed by independent researchers, contain observations not included in the official report. Collected soil samples from the center point show unprecedented levels of the crystalline structures first identified in the 2003 survey, now increased in concentration by an estimated 600%. More concerning is evidence of these structures in tissue samples from vegetation growing within the spiral. The crystalline formations appear to be integrating with plant cellular structures in a manner that suggests deliberate rather than random adaptation. The implications of an inorganic compound that can integrate with and potentially alter organic systems across species barriers are profoundly disturbing. The Forest Service team that made these discoveries was recalled before completing their survey, and the results of their partial study were classified under a federal directive that cited potential public health concerns. Unofficially, one team member reported that their final night in the field was marked by what they described as a humming vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, growing in intensity until small objects visibly trembled. More disturbing was their account of waking simultaneously from identical dreams in which they found themselves walking toward the center of the spiral, drawn by voices that spoke to each person in the voices of their loved ones. Dr. Blackwood herself requested reassignment to a different region shortly after submitting her report. In private correspondence with a colleague, she expressed deep unease about her experiences. "I've spent my career in the natural sciences, grounded in empirical observation and the established laws of biology. What we encountered defies these foundations. I found myself having thoughts that weren't my own, conceptual frameworks and perspectives that felt alien yet simultaneously familiar, as though I was remembering them rather than thinking them for the first time. Most disturbing was the sensation of being observed by the forest itself, not as a collection of individual organisms, but as a unified awareness using the trees as sensory apparatus. I know how this sounds, which is why I've shared it with no one but you. I'm scheduled for a medical evaluation next week. The headaches haven't subsided, and the dreams are becoming more vivid. Today, the area remains officially restricted, monitored by motion-activated cameras that transmit to a Forest Service facility. The recordings from these cameras are not available to the public, but a former technician who worked with the system reported frequent unexplained failures, particularly during new moon phases, when ambient light is at its minimum. They also mentioned that on multiple occasions, the cameras captured images of solitary figures approaching the center of the spiral formation, only to disappear from view despite there being nowhere within the camera's field of vision where they could have concealed themselves. The technician, who requested anonymity due to security clearance concerns, described one particularly disturbing recording: a figure approaching the center at night, moving in an unusual gait, fluid but somehow wrong, like the joints were bending in ways human joints don't bend. As it reached the center point where the old Stump house used to be, the figure appeared to separate into multiple silhouettes that overlapped and merged back together repeatedly before seeming to sink into the ground itself. The infrared showed a heat signature that split and recombined in the same pattern, so it wasn't just a visual artifact. I included the footage in my weekly report, but when I checked the archive the next day, that segment had been deleted. My supervisor told me there had been a technical glitch and to forget about it. Local residents avoid the area by unspoken agreement. Hunting guides refuse to take clients anywhere near it, regardless of the potential game. Even logging operations maintain a buffer zone of several miles, with workers reporting equipment malfunctions and unexplained illness when they attempt to work closer to what they've come to call the Whispering Ground. Ezekiel Crenshaw, a lifelong resident of Newton County and experienced hunter, explained the local perspective. "Folks around here, we got respect for the deep woods. Some places just ain't meant for people to be poking around in. That old Stump house site, my granddaddy used to say it was old before the settlers came, old before the natives even. Said the Cherokee wouldn't go near it 'cause they believed a spirit lived there that could get inside your head, make you think its thoughts instead of your own. I don't know about all that, but I know every animal in these woods gives that place a wide berth, and they got wisdom we'd be smart to heed." What began with a peculiar dwelling constructed by a reclusive man seeking isolation has evolved into something that defies conventional explanation, a mystery that spans generations and leaves behind physical evidence that challenges our understanding of the natural world. The Stump house that once stood in that remote corner of the Ozarks may be gone, but whatever secret Ambrose Caldwell sought to contain beneath it appears to remain, growing in influence as it spirals outward through the ancient forest. Those who have studied the case most thoroughly suggest that perhaps Dr. Augustus Montague's final journal entry contains the most important clue. His reference to becoming the vessel for the convergence, and his warning that what sleeps must remain asleep. If his experiments somehow created or contacted something that could persist beyond the normal boundaries of human consciousness, something that could continue to influence the physical world long after the deaths of those connected to it, then the spiral in the forest may represent not just a physical pattern, but the visible manifestation of an expanding influence. The most troubling possibility suggested by Dr. Whitcomb's research before his disappearance is that the symbols discovered in the underground chamber and later found repeated in various contexts throughout this strange history may function as more than passive recordings. If, as he theorized, they represent a form of encoded consciousness capable of transferring information directly to the observer's mind, then each person who encounters them, from Ambrose Caldwell to Morris Harrington to Elias Whitcomb, may have become part of a gradually expanding network, their individual awareness absorbed into something larger that continues to grow with each new connection. This hypothesis might explain the consistent pattern of symptoms observed in those affected, the extraction of teeth, perhaps serving as physical anchors of individual identity, the crystalline formations in the cranium, possibly a physical manifestation of the consciousness integration process, and the eventual disappearance of victims, their physical bodies perhaps no longer necessary once their consciousness has been fully incorporated into the collective awareness. For those inclined toward more conventional explanations, the possibilities of environmental contamination, hallucinogenic compounds in the local flora, or even mass suggestion might account for some elements of the story. Yet none of these explanations adequately addresses the physical evidence documented by multiple unrelated sources over decades: the unusual mineral compounds in the soil, the precisely arranged spiral of trees, the consistent pattern of physiological changes in both human and animal victims. What remains clear is that something unusual persists in that remote corner of the Ozark wilderness. Something that began with a doctor's unorthodox experiments, continued through the solitary life and mysterious death of a man who built his home from the stump of an ancient tree and continues to this day, patient and unseen, spiraling outward from its center like the symbols carved into the walls of a hidden chamber beneath the forest floor. The Stump house itself is long gone, its wooden structure returned to the earth from which it grew. But what lies beneath, what has always lain beneath, perhaps long before humans ever walked among these ancient hills, remains. And if the patterns hold true, it will continue to reach outward, gathering more voices for its composite consciousness, more awareness to add to its expanding dream, more teeth for its collection of anchors to the physical world. For those who value their safety and sanity, the forests of the Ozarks offer countless areas of natural beauty and solitude far from this troubled ground. But for those drawn to mysteries that defy explanation, the spiral in the trees stands as both warning and invitation, a pattern that, once recognized, may already be replicating itself in the neural pathways of your own mind, connecting you to something that waits patiently beneath a long-forgotten stump house in the wilderness.